May 28, 1940, Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Hermann Göring tossed the intelligence dossier onto his desk with open disdain. It outlined President Franklin D. Roosevelt's extraordinary appeal to Congress, a call to scale U.S. aircraft output to an unheard-of 50,000 planes per year. To the Reichsmarschall, this was not strategy, it was theatrical bluster. "If the Americans think such fabrications will intimidate us," he scoffed to his aides, "they reveal how little they understand the realities of war production. Let them attempt to retool their automobile plants. They'll soon discover that fighters and bombers demand far more than conveyor belts and unskilled hands." What Göring could not fathom, and what would ultimately doom the Third Reich, was that even as he spoke, a quiet revolution was already underway in the industrial heartland of the United States. In Detroit, William S. Knudsen, a Danish-born former president of General Motors, had accepted a symbolic salary of $1 a year to lead Roosevelt's unprecedented industrial mobilization. Tasked with turning peacetime factories into engines of total war, Knudsen was orchestrating a transformation so vast it would eclipse every previous feat of human industry. By 1944, just 4 years after Roosevelt's seemingly fantastical declaration, American production lines were not merely meeting the 50,000 aircraft benchmark. They were churning out nearly twice that number annually, all while supplying massive armies across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. The origins of this miracle traced back to May 16, 1940, as German panzers sliced through France. Standing before a skeptical Congress, Roosevelt had boldly proclaimed, "I should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year." The proposal stunned even America's allies. In 1939, the entire U.S. military aviation sector had delivered only 3,611 aircraft. The Army Air Corps fielded fewer than 1,700 combat-ready planes, many outdated. To multiply output by more than 14-fold seemed not just ambitious, but delusional. Yet Roosevelt had chosen the right architect. When asked who could possibly realize such a feat, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch offered a single, unwavering answer. First, Bill Knudsen. Second, Bill Knudsen. Third, Bill Knudsen. Knudsen had walked away from a $300,000 a year executive post to apply automotive mass production principles to aircraft manufacturing. His approach was deceptively simple: standardize, streamline, and scale. The results were swift. By December 1941, monthly military aircraft output had surged to 2,000, 20 times the rate of just 2 years earlier. Ford Motor Company broke ground on the colossal Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan. Boeing expanded its Seattle operations. Douglas Aircraft hired legions of new workers. The arsenal of democracy, once a rhetorical flourish, was becoming a tangible, roaring reality. German leadership, however, remained blind by arrogance, ideology, and racial prejudice. Despite accurate warnings from Friedrich von Boettcher, the Wehrmacht's military attaché in Washington from 1933 to 1941, who cabled in December 1940 that American war production will reach unimaginable heights, Berlin dismissed such reports as defeatist hysteria. When Boettcher met Hitler in 1939 to discuss U.S. industrial potential, the Führer ranted instead about America's supposed racial decay, calling its people half Judaized, half negrified, and refused to consider empirical data. This ideological myopia permeated the entire Nazi command structure. Luftwaffe intelligence interpreted the sight of women entering aircraft factories not as mobilization, but as desperation. Reports of round-the-clock shifts were assumed to be propaganda. The Nazi worldview simply could not accommodate the notion that a democratic society, driven by voluntary cooperation rather than state coercion, might outperform a totalitarian war machine. Nowhere was American ambition more vividly embodied than at Willow Run. Construction began on April 18, 1941, on open farmland. Within months, it housed the world's largest enclosed factory, 3.5 million square feet beneath a single roof, with an assembly line stretching a full mile. Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen, boldly pledged to roll out one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. compared to the industry standard of one per day. Early efforts faltered. The first Willow Run B-24, completed in September 1942, required complete disassembly and rebuild. Defect rates hovered near 50%. By early 1943, output lagged far behind promises, earning the plant the derisive nickname, "Will It Run?" But Ford's engineers refused to yield. They broke the B-24's nearly 500,000 parts into manageable subassemblies, invented hydraulic riveting tools, prefabricated wiring harnesses, and implemented moving assembly lines. Even as they absorbed 578 design modifications in 1943 alone, production climbed steadily. By September, 148 bombers left the line each month. By December, 365. The breakthrough came in April 1944. 428 B-24s, one every 63 minutes, around the clock. That single facility now outproduced the entire German aviation industry. German pilots began to grasp the truth during the Tunisian campaign. In December 1942, Major Johannes Steinhoff of Jagdgeschwader 77 noted with alarm, "The Americans are no longer novices. Worse, their numbers grow daily." The shift became undeniable in 1943. On January 27th, 64 U.S. bombers struck Wilhelmshaven, the first American raid on German soil. By October's Black Thursday over Schweinfurt, the U.S. could absorb the loss of 60 B-17s and replace them within 2 weeks. The arithmetic of attrition had turned irreversible. During Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces unleashed 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft plants. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, and more critically around 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Adolf Galland reported to Göring that Germany was losing 1,200 fighters monthly, while building only 1,000. America, meanwhile, was producing 2,500 fighters each month, while losing just 400. German ace Hans Eckehard Bob, with 220 confirmed kills, recalled a January 1944 mission over Brunswick. The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon, 700 fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless. By 1944, American production had reached staggering proportions. 96,270 aircraft that year alone, 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine planes. This single year's output exceeded Germany's total wartime production of approximately 94,677 aircraft. The disparity extended beyond numbers. American bombers bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns and advanced Norden bomb sights. German fighters often flew with partial ammunition and malfunctioning radios. Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was completing 16 B-17 daily by May 1944. Douglas Aircraft, which had employed just 68 people in 1936, now mobilized 167,000 workers across 9 sites. North American Aviation rolled out 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. Lockheed produced a P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, all while integrating over 2,000 combat-driven design changes. Supporting industries matched this tempo. General Motors built 57,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard manufactured 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlins. Alcoa's aluminum output surged by 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium production jumped from 6 million to 333 million pounds annually. Perhaps most shattering to Nazi assumptions was the transformation of the American workforce. In 1941, women made up less than 1% of aircraft workers. By 1943, they constituted 65%, over 310,000 strong. At Douglas's Long Beach plant, more than half the employees were women. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a symbol. Rose Wilmonsky, for instance, drove 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow Run with 99.5% accuracy. Female inspectors at Douglas slashed defect rates from 3.2% to 0.3%. Ford redesigned tools for smaller hands, inadvertently boosting efficiency and reducing fatigue. German intelligence, however, interpreted this integration of women as a sign of collapse, never imagining that precision and morale might actually improve. They could not conceive that democratic inclusion was a source of strength, not weakness. While America surged, Germany retreated into fantasy. In February 1944, Göring launched the Jägerstab program, scattering production into Bayer's 729 underground facilities, staffed by slave labor. The Mittelwerk complex alone employed 60,000 prisoners under horrific conditions. 20,000 perished. Yet these subterranean factories produced more defective parts than serviceable aircraft. Sabotage was rampant. Logistics between dispersed sites caused crippling delays. The entire Mittelwerk operation yielded fewer engines per month than Ford's single Chicago plant. Meanwhile, American innovation accelerated. Boeing pioneered modular construction for the B-29 Superfortress, 4 plants building interchangeable sections that assembled flawlessly. This pressurized, radar-equipped bomber, costing $659,000 each, incorporated technologies the Germans couldn't replicate even in prototypes. By early 1945, America was producing 100 B-29s monthly. D-Day, June 6, 1944, showcased the culmination of this industrial might. 11,590 Allied aircraft dominated the skies over Normandy, facing just around 319 German sorties, a 36-1 advantage. This wasn't tactical superiority, it was industrial annihilation. In the 5 months leading up to the invasion, Allied bombers dropped 145,000 tons of ordnance on German targets, more than the Luftwaffe had ever dropped on Britain. Transport fleets delivered 3 airborne divisions in a single day, using more aircraft than Germany's entire transport command had ever possessed. By December 1944, single raids featured 1,200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. The P-51 Mustang, with its transcontinental range and lethal performance, appeared everywhere. German pilots called them Indians for their swarming tactics. Even as defeat loomed, Nazi leaders began to acknowledge the truth. In December 1944, Goebbels confided in his diary that Göring's promises of air superiority now seemed criminal delusions. Rundstedt told his staff before D-Day, "The Americans can lose 10 tanks for every one we destroy and still overwhelm us. When they land, their material superiority will render every position untenable." And in January 1945, Hitler admitted to Speer, "We should have listened to Bettiker. Their industrial potential was decisive. While we built hundreds, they built tens of thousands." Albert Speer later testified that American bombing slashed German output by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, and 42% for trucks, declaring unequivocally that the systematic assault on industrial targets caused the breakdown of German armaments. Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied plane, represented genuine innovation. But Hitler and Göring fixated on it as a wonder weapon, ignoring that only 1,430s were ever built, with never more than 200 operational at once. Engines failed after 10 hours. Material shortages forced inferior substitutes. America, by contrast, had begun jet development in 1942. Though the Bell P-59 underperformed, Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, superior to any German jet, entered production before war's end. The U.S. could afford to pursue multiple technological paths simultaneously. Germany could not. In total war, quality without quantity was meaningless. Göring's arrest by the U.S. 36th Infantry Division on May 8, 1945, marked the start of his reckoning with reality. Initially defiant at the Augsburg Interrogation Center, he clung to the myth of German technological superiority, defeated only by overwhelming numbers. But at Camp Ashken in Luxembourg, intensive questioning by Major Kenneth Heckler in July 1945 forced a shift. "I knew American industrial potential was great," Göring admitted, "but the execution exceeded my worst fears. That single factory at Willow Run produced more aircraft than our entire bomber force at its peak. It was incomprehensible." He was especially stunned by U.S. logistics. "You supplied armies 5,000 miles from home while maintaining domestic production. We struggled to supply forces 500 miles away." At Nuremberg, prosecutors confronted him with irrefutable evidence. Charts showing America's past monthly aircraft output in 1944 surpassing Germany's annual total. Films of Willow Run's assembly lines, lists of cities destroyed by bombers built there. On March 14, 1946, Göring testified, "I believe the U.S. had great economic and technical capacity, but I never imagined a 100-fold increase in 4 years. Such growth seemed physically impossible." Prison psychologist G.M. Gilbert noted Göring's obsession with production ratios, particularly his fixation on Willow Run, that damned factory that broke our backs. When shown that America produced 812,615 aircraft engines, to Germany's 241,675, Göring simply stared in silence. The scale of the American transformation remains staggering. From 3,611 military aircraft in 1939 to 295,959 by war's end, 97,810 bombers, 99,465 fighters, and nearly 100,000 other aircraft. This was not mere volume, but systemic superiority. At its height, 2 million Americans worked in aviation, including women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, disabled citizens, teenagers, and seniors. This democratic mobilization achieved what forced labor never could: voluntary cooperation that outperformed coercion on every metric. The workforce that entered factories in 1941 with no aviation experience emerged in 1945 as the world's most skilled aerospace builders. They didn't just assemble planes, they reinvented manufacturing. Statistical quality control, pioneered for bombers, became global industrial standard. Automation principles from Willow Run reshaped factories worldwide. The engineers who designed bomber lines would later build the Saturn V rocket. The women who riveted B-24s would raise children who walked on the moon. Financially, the effort defied orthodoxy. $45 billion in 1940s dollars, roughly $800 billion today, was spent on aircraft alone. The B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project. Yet instead of bankrupting the nation, war production eradicated unemployment and doubled personal income between 1940 and 1945. Workers financed much of it themselves. Willow Run employees alone bought $45 million in war bonds funding their own plant. Germany, by contrast, devoted 40% of its industrial capacity to aircraft by 1944, yet produced less than half of America's output. Slave labor proved catastrophically inefficient. Sabotage, collapsing quality, and declining productivity after 1943 contrasted sharply with America's 300% productivity gain. Post-war, this industrial infrastructure became the bedrock of American prosperity. Aluminum plants built for bombers supplied materials for suburban homes. Chemical factories switched from aviation fuel to consumer plastics. Machine tool makers equipped a nation for global economic leadership. Beyond production volume lay organizational brilliance. The War Production Board seamlessly coordinated. 184,000 companies. IBM punch cards tracked millions of components. MIT's radiation laboratory, employing 4,000 scientists, developed all-weather navigation systems. When combat revealed B-17 vulnerabilities, Boeing added chin turrets in 60 days. When Pacific operations demanded longer range, consolidated modified B-24s without halting production. German modifications took months. American ones took weeks. This adaptability, fueled by rapid feedback between front lines and factory floors, proved as decisive as raw output. On October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, Göring wrote his final letter. "The Americans won through industrial power, not military prowess. We were not defeated by better soldiers, but by better factories. The nation we dismissed as capable only of building consumer goods buried the Wehrmacht under aluminum and steel." His last words to Gilbert were equally stark. "We declared war on an industrial giant while it slept. When it awoke, we were doomed. They didn't just outproduce us. They revolutionized production itself." Göring took his own life that night, but his testimony endures as history's verdict on the production war. Military historians widely regard America's industrial achievement as the decisive factor in Allied victory. Without it, D-Day, the strategic bombing campaign, and the Pacific Island hopping offensive would have been impossible. As historian Richard Overy concluded, "The outcome was determined not by fighting spirit or tactical brilliance, but by the weight of material." By 1944, the United States alone produced way more military aircraft than the rest of the world combined, Axis and allies alike. This was not marginal superiority, but order of magnitude dominance. Yet the deeper victory lay in method. Free workers outproduced slaves, democratic cooperation surpassed totalitarian command, and a diverse citizenry united by purpose achieved the impossible. The B-24s rolling off Willow Run every 63 minutes were more than machines. They were democracy's rebuttal to tyranny. Each rivet driven by a former housewife, each engine assembled by a teenager who'd left school to serve, each wing built by immigrants escaping poverty, all testified that free peoples, when rallied to a just cause, can bury oppression beneath an avalanche of production. Göring had laughed at Roosevelt's impossible goal of 50,000 planes a year. America answered by producing nearly 100,000, and in doing so reshaped the course of history. His contempt became the epitaph of a regime that confused racial dogma with industrial reality, that mistook brutality for strength, and that fatally underestimated the productive power of a free society. In the end, the numbers tell a brutal truth. America, 295,959 military aircraft. Germany, 94,677. But the real triumph was not in the tally. It was in the system. The arsenal of democracy proved that assembly lines could be as decisive as battle lines, and that the hands that build can be as vital as those that fight. Göring's laughter in May 1940 echoed through history, not as defiance, but as the sound of catastrophic miscalculation. And when the final bomber rolled off the line, it carried not just bombs, but the verdict. Democracy had not just won the war, it had redefined what victory meant.